What I say and what you hear be in the name of God. Amen. So we welcome our guest organist today, Carolyn. Well, don't applaud yet, because you're going to applaud here in a moment, because Kimberly Joy Potterton entered the world earlier this week. So Robert is with his family, his new daughter. From the gospel today, there is no judgment against anyone who believes in him, but anyone who does not believe in him has already been judged for not believing in God's one and only Son. And the judgment is based on this fact. God's light has come into the world, but people love the darkness more than the light, for their actions were evil. Well, Lent is as good a time as any, I suppose, to talk about judgment. All right. And, of course, there are two kinds. There's human judgment, and there's God's judgment. But even when it comes to human judgment, there's the right kind and the wrong kind. And really, when it comes to Americans, I think in particular, and by the way, if you don't see yourself in this sermon, you aren't looking very hard. Okay, everyone is in the crosshairs today. Okay, we have a double standard when it comes to judging. And it works like this. I can judge, you can't. I'm the judge, I'll be the judge of that. Don't judge me. Right? So I can judge, but you can't. That's the double standard. And it's the kind of judgment that Jesus condemns. The New Testament in general condemns this kind of self-righteous judgmentalism, which we all are prone to. And when it comes to judgmentalism, I think that's the primary danger, is that smug self-righteousness. And there's three traits of the self-righteous, and these overlap, really. Maybe there are three ways of saying the same thing. The first is that the self-righteous, which is you and me, we want justice for others and mercy for ourselves. How many times have you're driving down a road or highway or whatever, and someone goes blowing by you, whoo, and you say to yourself, where are the cops when you need one? Justice. Until you are the one that's pulled over. But officer, I was going somewhere important. Or officer, it was a mistake. Give me a break. Cut me a break. Just give me a warning. We want justice for others and mercy for ourselves. The other two traits, these really do overlap. One is that the self-righteous judge others with a faulty standard, namely ourselves. And correlating with this is we think that our judgments are superior to others. My judgment is always going to be better than yours because I'm just a better judge in general. That's how we think. That's how we act. The problem, of course, is that as Jesus tells us not to do in John's gospel, we judge sometimes by appearances, and we're quick to judge. And there's a story about this that I think is spot on. The story of a guy who owned a cabin in the mountains, and he used to love to go up there on the weekends. And one afternoon, he's driving up the mountain, and it's lots of blind curves, very windy road. And on this particular beautiful day, he's driving up, and a car comes around one of these blind curves, and it's almost out of control. As it comes around the corner, the car swerves into his lane, and then back into its own lane, and back into his lane, and back into his own lane, back into his lane, and at the last second, the car gets back into its own lane, and as it passes, he sees this beautiful woman in the driver's seat, and their eyes meet, and she yells, "Pig!" And without missing a beat, he goes, "Sow!" How dare she, he thought to himself. I'm the pig. I was in my lane. I was driving the speed limit. Who does she think she is? Well, at least she didn't get away before I gave her my snappy retort. That sow. And with that, he stepped on the gas, went around the curve, and ran right into the pig. That's the smug, self-righteous human judgment. When it suits our purposes, we may quote, we may not always know where we're quoting from, but it's from Matthew chapter 7, "Don't judge lest ye be judged." It's wrong to judge. No, it's not wrong to judge. In fact, you can't go through life without judging. I mean, I don't even know how many times a day we make judgments. We do it all the time. It's simply impossible to live without judging. It's the way we judge. It's the methodology that we use that's the problem. So what would be the methodology? Jesus, in John's gospel, Jesus says, don't judge by appearances, but then he immediately says, judge correctly. Well, what would be the correct way to judge? Not easy, but it's the example that we see in Jesus. God's judgment is the plumb line. It's the measuring stick that we use when judging others, when we're judging a situation. We're making a decision between this or that. Is this right, whatever. Is this person in the right or in the wrong? We make these judgments. If we make these judgments in a godly way, then they're done correctly. We're told in the New Testament, for example, that Christians need to, if you will, take the wrongdoer aside in the church and correct them. Now, that may seem like, well, we shouldn't do that because that's judgmental. Well, no, not really. I mean, I can tell you for a fact that if more churches did some really solid judging, there would be a lot less conflict. There would be a lot less turmoil in parishes that get rent asunder because they've been taken hostage by someone that no one is able to stand up to and say, hey, I think your behavior's wrong. I think this is out of place. So we need to be aware of these kind of things, that we are called to judge. The judgment of God, and there's three things. The judgment of God is, first of all, good. Jesus, when you look at his life, his judging came out of two desires. One, he judged in service to God's justice. Secondly, he judged in a way that released people and set them free from bondage. When Jesus would lay into the religious leaders and say, you hypocrites, this is in service to God's justice. Jews in Jerusalem, the temple, were meant to be a city on the hill, a light to the nations, but they had circled the wagons and closed themselves off. And the thing about following the law, as far as the religious leaders were concerned, is it was a way to exclude people. If I follow the law, then I'm Jewish and you're not. And if you're not, you're out. And Jesus had a problem with that. He had a big problem with that. And so, in service of God's justice, Jesus was judgmental of the religious leaders. He even, as I said, I think last week, when Jesus cleansed the temple, it was actually a prophetic acting out of judgment against the temple, because it had not become a place where all people could come to God. It was a place of exclusion. But Jesus also judged in a way that set people free. Now, you probably don't think of Jesus' life and ministry this way, but Jesus judged a lot of people. But he judged his own way, not the world's way. So, in John chapter 4, one of my favorite exchanges between Jesus and another person is the Samaritan woman at the well. If Jesus had judged by the standard of the day, he would have gone all the way around Samaria instead of going right through it, to say nothing of the fact of talking to this Samaritan woman. Unclean, you don't do that, especially a teacher of the status of Jesus. What are you doing? But Jesus doesn't judge by appearances. He judges differently. Or the woman caught in adultery. You know how the story goes. He was without sin, cast the first stone. And they all walk away, and Jesus looks at the woman and says, well, isn't there anyone who's going to condemn you? No, sir. Well, neither will I. Go and sin no more. Or Zacchaeus, the tax collector. Jesus invites himself over to dinner. Now, again, if Jesus were going to judge based on the standard of the day, you won't go to the home of a tax collector because they are lower than dirt. The tax collectors were Jews who collected taxes for Romans, and in order for them to make a living, they took more than was necessary and kept the rest for themselves. They were hated and despised. And here's Jesus going to dinner with one. At one level, everything that Jesus did in terms of healing people, forgiving people, and all that is judgment. And it may be very helpful for you to reflect on those aspects of Jesus' life in that way, and to see them as God's judgment being lived out. So God's judgment is good. Secondly, God's judgment is, well, God's. Now, before you say that's obvious, is it? Is it obvious? I don't think so. Because especially when it comes to Judgment Day and, the rapture and Armageddon and all of that, I've said this before. When I look at the God depicted in some of the Christian imagery regarding the final judgment, I scratch my head and go, what God is that? Because that God doesn't seem to have any relationship or bearing with Jesus, the Jesus of the Gospels. So keep in mind that God's judgment is his. Now, here's a couple of ways to think about the judgment of God. There are two primary ways that we think about it. One is very familiar to you, and it's the law court. This is the image where we're sinners and we're guilty, and we stand before God the judge, and we're pronounced guilty, but Jesus steps in and takes the punishment on himself, takes the judgment on himself. That's very familiar. It's biblical, but there's another way of looking at judgment, and this is important because there isn't one way of conceptualizing the judgment of God in the New Testament. And the other way is in today's gospel, where Jesus said the judgment is based on this fact. The light came into the world, and people loved the darkness rather than the light. Now let's think about that. At my home, let's say I'm going to have some people over for dinner. And I turn on all the lights in the room, and all of a sudden, I see dust everywhere. Oh, look at those cobwebs. Oh, maybe if I just turn down the lights, people won't see. Now, the light, the dust and the cobwebs aren't being judged. They're being exposed. And that's what light does. Light just does what it does. There isn't any judgmentalism involved. It just does what it does. The light comes on and everything is visible, whether you like it or not. It isn't about whether God's punishing you, trying to make you feel bad. The light has come on and you're exposed. And the real judgment is the next thing that happens. The word, by the way, that's used at this point in the gospel is the Greek word krisis, from which we get the word crisis. Okay, and it literally means like a severing. In other words, you have two choices to make. You immediately are confronted with a choice. And what is the choice? To stay in the light or run from the light. You see how this is all up to you. God is the light, and the light does what the light does. And when you get exposed, that creates a crisis. And the crisis is really about what you do next. Are you going to stay in the light, or are you going to run for the shadows? I think it's important when we think about God's judgment to try to balance between these two images, the one on the punishment side of the equation and this other one that is more abstract, if you will. I've talked about this in other ways, and just let me dwell on this for just another moment. One of the ways that I've tried to help people see what I'm talking about is to use the example of speeding. You're in a car and you're speeding, and you get pulled over and you get a ticket. The ticket is punishment for driving too fast. But what if you're in the car, you're driving too fast, and it's a bad day, and it's a curve, and you misjudged it, you're going too fast, and the car goes out of control and crashes or goes over a cliff or whatever. We don't describe that latter scenario in terms of punishment. We describe it as a consequence. It's just what happens. I mean, the laws of physics are what the laws of physics are. And, an object in motion stays in motion until something stops it, and that might be a tree, that might be the ground, it might be the bottom of a cliff. But it's just, that's the way life works. We don't describe those scenarios as punishment. Maybe the person lacked judgment when they were driving, but it's not a punishment. So Paul in Romans 8 says, or I'm not sure, don't quote me on that chapter. All of a sudden I'm a little bit confused about what chapter it is, but I know it's in Romans. The wages of sin is death. Paul is describing something like your car is going to go over a cliff, period. That's it. All right, you're right. The wages of sin is death. That's it. End of story. Life, that's the way life is. But what happened to Jesus on the cross? He died. And the whole point of the New Testament is that was God taking the consequence. You can call it punishment if that helps you conceptualize what's happening on the cross, or you can see it as God taking the inevitable outcome of sin on himself and rescuing you from danger, which is another biblical image. Neither one is right or wrong, that is to say the law court image or this other, let's just call it the consequences of sin. Neither of those are better than the other. They're just both ways of trying to describe how God's judgment works. And finally, God's judgment is global. He will judge the world in righteousness and the peoples with equity. God has the whole creation in view. It's not just you. God's judgment is not I don't even think it's primarily about you. That is to say, it's not about God judging you. It's about God wanting to bring all creation back together and to reunite it. And you are part of that creation. It isn't just about you. And so the image of Revelation chapter 21, verse 1, I saw a new heaven and a new earth. The old earth had passed away. This is an image of the day of judgment. That's a very different picture from Armageddon, of the renewal of heaven and earth. Paul wrote this, and this is Romans 8, verses 19 to 21. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. God's judgment is good. God's judgment is God's. And it's global or cosmic. So be careful. Be careful about the self-righteous judging, which we all, sadly, all too easily slip into. I mean, it's okay for me to slip into it because my judgment's better than yours. You get it. You get it. Demanding justice for others and mercy for ourselves. Judging other people by our own measuring stick and thinking that our judgments are superior to everybody else's. We need to judge the way we've been taught to judge by God himself in Jesus Christ. His judgment is good because it's God's. And his judgment, it's about the whole creation, including you, being brought to oneness with him. That is at one meant atonement. Amen.